Australia Post has been delivering across this wide brown land for generations. But the tale of this country began with the original storytellers long, long ago. For 65,000 years, this continent has been home to hundreds of nations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They are the custodians of the land, water and sky that surrounds us, with a connection to country that has never waned. For millennia, they have passed down language, culture and traditions through song, dance and story, connecting the past with the future. Today, we pay respect to elders past, present and future and recognise the contribution of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We hear their voice and look to work towards a more reconciled future. Together, we learn and share the story of this country.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Business Talks, Australia Post's signature webinar series where we bring together the brightest minds and boldest ideas shaping the future of e-commerce. I'm thrilled to introduce today's session, Winning in the Fast Lane, how Aussie brands can win in a rapidly changing market. Whether you're joining us live, catching up later, or tuning in as a podcast while on the move, this session has been designed with you in mind. It's flexible, insightful, and packed with practical takeaways to help you with your business growth. Today, we're diving into the strategies that are helping Australian brands not just survive, but thrive in a market that's moving faster than ever. From social commerce to customer experience tech, from global expansion to decoding the next generation of shoppers, this is your front row seat to the future of e-commerce. Now, here's what you can expect. First up, I'll have a chat with Mark McCrindle, founder of McCrindle Research. He'll help us decode the next generation's shopping behaviours and explore what the ultimate future e-commerce experience could look like. Then we'll hear from Jordan Burke, CEO at Tomorrow, who will take us on a deep dive into global strategy. He'll unpack the power of localisation, the rise of content commerce, and how brands can be strategic with how they scale in a fragmented digital world. And finally, we'll move into a panel discussion featuring Julie Mathers, CEO and founder at Snuggle Hunny, Matthew Horn, Group General Manager at Country Road, and Tara McKeon, founder of Proud Poppy. This is a session for anyone who wants to stay ahead of the curve, whether you're in retail, logistics, marketing, or strategy. And if you find something that resonates, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your team, your network, and your customers. Now, we'll be taking questions throughout, so please send them through via the Q&A widget in your console. We have time at the end of the session to answer as many questions as we can. Now, settle in and let's explore how Aussie brands are winning in the fast lane. Now, today I'm very lucky to be joined by one of the most respected voices in social research, Mark McCrindle, founder and CEO of McCrindle Research. Mark, welcome.
Thanks, Gary.
Now, we've always loved working with you and your team, and we worked this year on the Australia's e-commerce report again, and it was no exception, a really interesting report. Your insights about how people are shopping and generational behaviours are just so valuable. So let's start there. You led some fascinating research for the report. What were some of the key themes that emerged?
Well, the data showed just once again how Australian customers are early adopters. They're looking for innovations in their interactions. And for example, we found that almost half of Australians shop online at least weekly. And it was significantly higher with the younger generation, those in their 20s. And on Generation Z, those in their 20s, we found that almost 3 in 4 of them have shopped through social media. So they're certainly responding to new forms of interaction and connection. So we looked at the themes of technologically integrated. That's the Australian customer. They're using the technology. And secondly, globally connected. If something's happening over there, it's going to wash ashore here. And we looked at how connected globally Australians are. And the third theme we looked at there was socially integrated or socially influenced. And that's not just through sort of social media influencers, but it's getting the advice and input of others. It's having a social care and concern around their purchasing, and that leads to a difference in what they look for and how they engage.
Right, so a lot to think about there. And It's clear from your research, and again this year, that it's critical for retailers to understand the shifting needs of the generations. Each generation is distinctly different. So from your perspective, why is tailoring the customer experience to generational preferences essential now to staying competitive in e-commerce?
Well, because it's probably the first segment to really understand. We're all aware that there are different consumer segments out there, and some of those might be geographical, or they might be cultural or socioeconomic, but the generational one is multifactorial because it defines someone's age or life stage. And clearly, teenagers have different needs to 30-somethings or 60-somethings, but it's far more than that. It also defines the times that shaped them, and the technologies, the events, the influences, the social expectations leaves fingerprints on us in our formative years, and that's different for each generation. So from an e-commerce or retail perspective, the baby boomers and Gen Xers were shaped in a world from a payments perspective where cash was king and check dominated. And now we've got the younger generation growing up in a world of digital payments, contactless, crypto. If you think about a marketing perspective, the older generations grew up in the world where it was broadcast advertising, it was mass media. And in the span of a couple of generations, you've got a new generation that have only ever known social media influence and the connection online, the influence through AI influencing choices as well. Even from a customer service perspective, the older generations were used to going in to solve a problem or maybe a call centre, but now it's a generation, we found Generation Z, the majority would rather interact with a chatbot than speak to someone at a call centre. So the times, the technologies, the era shapes us significantly, and that's why understanding each generation is key. We might have been able to connect with boomers or Gen Xers, but that doesn't mean we'll automatically connect with Generation Alpha if we don't understand the changes.
Now, you mentioned Generation Alpha, and you quite literally wrote the book on Generation Alpha. So for anyone unfamiliar, who are Gen Alpha, and why should retailers be paying attention to them?
Well, it's the generation born from 2010 through to 2024. So this whole generation is here with us. And that 15-year span of birth coincides with this rapid transformation in our technologies, in our social context, in our demographics, in our era. And so they're older teenagers at the oldest edge. They're the young children at the youngest edge. And while they're not yet in that earning stage, they already influence or directly spend $8.5 trillion globally. That's almost 10% of global customer expenditure. So they're already having a big impact, and that's because they influence not just their own pocket money, but spending beyond themselves, the kidfluence, as it's been called, influencing what once parental choices like the family car that's purchased or the holiday or the school they go to. The kids have great influence, and they're the key target market from a social media perspective. They drive the popular culture, they drive the trends online, and so for all those reasons, people are understanding them. Within a decade, they'll be 1 in 5 of the workforce. So they're fast moving from the learning stage to the earning stage. And the facts about them is they are a superlative generation in so many ways because they're the largest generation globally these last 15 years of births, and they're the most digitally connected and globally engaged and formally educated generation as well. And with all of that comes a sophistication that they're used to advertising and marketing. They know their way around a digital era, and so we've got to connect with them in new ways and engaging ways, not just think that they'll respond the same way previous generations did.
And I guess you said that they're influencing their parents and they're influencing buying decisions. So retailers will want to market to them, but also their customer or the person actually making the purchase may be their parents or others around them. So they have to think about that in a multi-dimensional way, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, the kids have access to payment platforms, digital wallets, even before they have credit cards. So they do have access to parental spend in that way. These fintech products that kids access that whether it be in an online world, in a gamification world, or just even as they're buying things from up the road, or in an e-commerce sense, they're definitely engaged as customers.
So, and maybe I'll just go back then to the other end of the spectrum and baby boomers. So you talked about what they grow up with cash and the way they went about things in that time. But they have evolved too, I guess, because I know my parents in their mid-80s are now shopping online way more than they did pre-COVID. So I assume that generation is still they've got money to spend. They typically don't have mortgages and are an input for those, depending on your product or service, are an important focal point.
Totally, Gary. You know, the younger generations drive the popular culture, the older generations drive the economy. They are the wealth accumulators, they are the high net worth generation, and they are the big spenders. And of course, they've adapted, as you said. You know, they're not stuck in the 1970s or 1980s that might have shaped them. They're responding to the times. That's part of the innovation. That's part of the journey that we're all on. But particularly Australian consumers, they are responding to trends and changes in e-commerce and in the retail world generally. And this generation of older Australians are leading that transition.
Right. Now, let's maybe turn to, so we've talked a little bit about the generations and important of focus for retailers. But something interesting in the report, and of course important to Australia Post, is just around delivery expectations across the generations. Can you talk us through what that looks like in practice and what it means for e-commerce businesses, given the different generations have different preferences?
Yeah, well, we found three key themes there. Firstly, reliability. That 4 in 5 Australians said that reliability of delivery was essential. And there's almost that brand extension that if the reliability of the delivery is there, that leads and builds more trust with the product and the retailer. The second area was transparency. That they want transparency of costs. They want to know what the delivery costs are, because from a customer perspective, that's all just part of the overall transaction cost or purchasing cost. And this third area was around the personalisation, if you like, the brand experience. So in e-commerce, they're not getting the in-store brand experience. So the brand experience they have is the delivery, is the unboxing, is the packaging, and is that whole experience of the purchase. And so creating that real connection, that brand value around that whole experience is key for e-commerce success.
Right. Now, in the report, you mentioned that 62% of shoppers switch brands to save money, and 57% of people compromise their social responsibility, their values, to purchase a cheaper product. So if brands are struggling to compete on price, how else can they stand out?
Yeah, it's a key theme because, you know, values do matter, and what the product stands for, and the history, the story behind it, the authenticity, all of that is so key. But price is a key factor at the moment as well. And so Australians are juggling. That's why we call it this consumer compromise, that they've got their expectations of what they want in a product around maybe the environmental credentials. They want to buy local, they want to support family, they want to buy a brand that's maybe got some values around it that they personally resonate with, but price has to be right for them, because in this period, making that household budget or that personal budget work is key. So it's the values and it's the value that they bring to the equation. But when there is that authenticity, when there is a story behind the brand, when we are connecting and understanding what the customer is and meeting their particular need, when in a sense it's not one size fits all, but there is that personalisation, that customisation, and we're really understanding our niche and connecting, that makes a big difference. And even if price can't quite compete, it's that experience, that connection for that targeted consumer segment that is going to win the day.
And just on that, the sustainability piece, do you think is it a point in time issue given cost of living? And if we get to a position where cost of living is not as much an issue, some of the research I see suggests that we say that we care about the environment. Will we actually put our money where our mouth is and actually pay more for a product or service that we know is more sustainable? That doesn't necessarily always play out. So do you have a perspective on that? Yeah,
well, that's right, Gary. That's what the research was showing. Even, surprisingly, with the younger generations who are quite virtuous around the environment, who've grown up with that as a key focus for them, are even compromising a little bit at the moment on price. But I do think it's a point in time. I think we're in a point where the cost of living is such that people are feeling that it's a compromise. They're not saying I'm just going to buy the cheapest. They're saying, look, I have to compromise on my preferred values just for the price at the moment. But if things come back, and if I get a sense that I'm winning again economically, I'll come back to those values. So it's a given. It's embedded for this younger generation, particularly, that environmental concerns and values of product are key. And we'll come back to that, particularly as the economy roars back and as this generation feels they've got a little bit more leverage in that equation.
So perhaps one last question then, and when you and I were doing the launch together back in March, we talked a little bit about AI and how consumers are now starting to engage with AI, and the younger generations particularly, and Gen Alpha will be almost native to them. What impact does that have in terms of how consumers are searching for products and the role it may play in the future?
Well, they have integrated the younger generation's AI seamlessly into their lives. And as I said, they'll rather talk to a chatbot than a human in a call center. So artificial intelligence is almost seamlessly part of their experience. And so it is when it comes to even buying or buy recommendations. I mean, even the playlist on their Spotify or the watch list on Netflix, a lot of that is generated, of course, through these algorithms. And so they expect that convenience. They're happy to trade off a little bit of, if you like, privacy or the human interaction for the pragmatic benefit that AI brings. They see the leverage and the benefit that it brings, and so they'll bring that to e-commerce as well. And that's why they're already starting to buy through social media platforms with AI-generated suggestions, and we can only expect that to continue in the future.
Now, I could keep asking questions for hours. It's always fascinating, but thank you so much. If you'd like to explore more of Mark's insights, including how each generation shops, what they value and what they expect to check out, it's all in the Australia Post 2025 e-commerce report, available online now. Now, let's hear from some of the other local businesses who contributed to this year's e-commerce report. Then, Julie Mathers sits down with winners of Inside Retail's Top 50 People in E-commerce, Matthew Horn and Tara McKeon, so don't go anywhere.
2024 was challenging for e-commerce. We didn't have the growth that many people anticipated. So what that meant is we had to adapt and expand and do things differently.
The way you go about customer acquisition is changing. We very much had to change our focus to social-led acquisition.
If we look at some of the data trends, there's a lot more reliance from our fans on convenience and personalisation.
We've got a community now, and we can tell what people get really excited about our tea and also talk about our story.
The report is great because it gives you insights that possibly you didn't consider. It shows you what trends are happening and provides thought-provoking ideas to try and improve the business.
I think data is super helpful and important for us to be able to grow and make our whole business work.
It helps inform our marketing, our strategy in terms of delivery and our general product. We are heading into new markets and we want to understand exactly what they expect from us, and their expectations are different.
We're very happy about what the future holds, and we're strong believers that over the next couple of years there's going to be strong growth in e-commerce.
Everything's changing and it's really hard. It's really hard, but it's fun as well. I'm loving it.
Welcome back to the Australia Post Business Talks webinar. I'm Julie Mathers, CEO of Snuggle Hunny, and this year I was honoured to be inducted into the Top 50 People in E-commerce Hall of Fame. Joining me today are two of the top performers from this year's Top 50 People in E-commerce list, Tara McKeon, founder and CEO of Pride Poppy Clothing, and Matthew Horn, Group GM of Country Road Group. Together, they've each led standout results in one of the most competitive and fast-moving e-commerce markets we've ever seen. Thank you both for joining me on the couch today. So let's get started. Today's theme is winning in the fast lane, how Aussie businesses are thriving in a rapidly changing e-commerce market. So Tara and Matt, we all know the pace of change has been intense and the big international players are tough competition. So what impact is this having on your companies and how are you tackling it? And Matt, we might start with you.
Yeah, of course. I think in terms of how we think about it internally, you've got to start from a place of respect. I think these businesses have scaled for a reason. And you've got to admire the ruthless focus that they have on how they're going to win and the courage that they've had to reorganize their entire business around that, to really double down on that. And so, that can be really challenging and you can get lost in the advantages that they have. Sometimes they feel fair and unfair, whatever. But I think for me, it's more about what can we learn from these guys? Because I think if you look at a lot of them, there's a fairly repeatable playbook at the core of what they're doing, right? Like it's a really incredibly sharp customer value prop. It's growth driven by an incredible focus on performance marketing and then just a ruthless obsession with eliminating friction from the customer experience and UX. And so for us, it's how can we take some of those winning elements of their formula and repeat them in our own business, rather than just being dismissive or a little bit defensive about the threat they pose to our business.
I love that. Learn from them. So, yeah, love that. Tara, what are your thoughts?
I agree with Matt as well. There's definitely a lot that we can learn, but I also think there's a lot of things that we do in Australia really well. And it's just doubling down on that experience, giving that really beautiful personal experience, whether that be in store or online, showing up as, founders and creatives, and just really strengthening that face to brand connection so that the consumers know who they are supporting. Aussies love to support Aussie businesses, so just really showing up and letting people know who they're supporting when they purchase from you, I think makes a world of difference.
Yeah, totally agree. On that note, that leads us nicely into the next question actually for you, Tara. Proud Poppy has built a beautiful community that is fiercely loyal and deeply engaged. I love what you do. So what have been some of the most powerful strategies that have helped you stay ahead of changing customer behaviour, and particularly on social?
I think my biggest strategy is that we don't really have a strategy. Everything that we do is led by authenticity and transparency. We really care about building genuine connections with our community. It comes from, we're a big business, but we've also got a big heart. So we've never lost that soul as we've grown. And that's really important. That's a non-negotiable for me. So if I find that we are getting too far ahead and we're running too fast, we're never afraid just to slow down and take a step back and just really reassess where we are and if we're losing any connection with our community, just trying to reestablish that again before we grow. We've definitely seen some challenges there where, things happen so fast and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, hang on a minute, why are we doing this? So just coming back to your why and always keeping that, as your North Star, community as your North Star. But yeah, no real strategy, just really showing up authentically and just being ourselves, and people can relate to it. And I think people just love to see realness in a world full of filters.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Social's changed, and in a really good way. Yeah. So it's really great now.
We were almost one step ahead of the game without even knowing it. So we've never done filters or highly edited videos, and now we're like, oh, okay, now we're great at this.
Everyone loves to see you as you've just got out of bed. It's good. Thank you, Tara. Okay, Matt, Country Roads on a massively different scale, but evolving fast. So what CX design changes have driven the most impact for you recently, and what does that tell you about your customers' evolving preferences?
I think maybe two things. I definitely big +1 to what Tara was saying about authenticity and how you can build that in Australia in response to some of these international pressures. Authenticity is the currency of trust, I think, in this kind of market. So we that definitely really resonates strongly in terms of where our focuses are. I think, more directly, the answer to that question from my perspective is, we've been on a journey of some pretty significant digital transformation at CRG over the last couple of years. It's been fantastic. We have all the usual problems of a big legacy retailer with some terrible tech that we've sort of made some strategic decisions in sort of targeting. And that's been a privilege to have the resources to sort of execute on that. But for me, I think it's really actually, day to day, the challenge I set myself and increasingly the challenge I set my team is kind of similar challenges to Tara. I don't think scale actually matters to some degree, because I think there's something really powerful in the fact that in the spirit of if you can't beat them, join them. A company as big, as complicated, as sophisticated as Amazon, just to name one of the big international challengers, if even they, at this point in their journey, at their revenue line, one of their core fundamentals as a strategic pillar is nailed basics, I think there's something really powerful in that. And I think, businesses at our scale often get lost in the complexity and, the cool stuff you can do, the new and shiny, but at the expense of some of what's really at the core of the business. And I think smaller businesses are really good at that, right? Because it's you live or die on that, quite literally. So for us, it's really about that laser focus on how can we optimize our path to purchases as much as possible. So simplifying the mobile journeys, really thinking differently about our product description pages, and how can we elevate what the consumer really needs to support that purchasing decision and those kinds of things. And it's sort of individually, none of this stuff is incredibly sexy or glamorous work, particularly in this age of Gen AI. But it drives enormous results, particularly when you've got that scale. And so, for instance, one of the biggest changes we've made that has been hugely successful a little while ago is something as simple as, we're a product business. Are our product description pages actually heroing our product in the way we would love? And when I looked at it, actually, a lot of the imagery was really compressed, even though we're sort of shooting it in really, really high res imagery in great studios. But the consumer if they can't touch and feel the product, how do you really hero the product in that kind of sense? So I think it's sort of, really, really focusing on the fundamentals and the basics, nailing that. And I guess the big thing, particularly for us in our spaces as a series of brands, yes, our e-commerce presence has a role to play in terms of, the storytelling of provenance from a materials perspective, our sustainability story as well. But at the end of the day, an e-commerce site is there to help the customer part with their money, to be really blunt. So how do we just get out of the customer's way, give them what they need? And for those that are just intent on really just, closing that purchase and getting what they want, just helping them on that journey as well and making it as seamless as possible.
Love it. Nail the basics. I was at an expo on the weekend and a customer was looking at one of our products and they said, do I just get one milestone card with this? Because it looks like that on the website. And it's like, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm like, we've got to change that. You get a box of 25. So we spent yesterday changing the descriptions.
It's also amazing how how desensitized we've come as of brand custodians or e-commerce players to actually all the little points of friction that we don't work. I mean, particularly in omnichannel, I don't think there's many people in market who've gotten click and collect right? It's still a pretty clunky experience, for instance. So what are we doing about that stuff? So,
love it. That's so important. Okay. Across both your businesses, how important is delivery experience in shaping customer loyalty, especially in a market where speed, and you mentioned Amazon before, and transparency are increasingly expected? So Tara, I might go to you.
Yeah, for sure. So we've definitely seen unexpected delays recently, as I'm sure most businesses have in logistics and freight and everything that's been going on in the world. So once we do get our product and we are getting it out the door, it's really important that we can get that to the customer as quickly as possible. Often she's purchasing with an event in mind, so it's really important we get it there and in her hands to try and to feel amazing in. Always looking at ways to improve, but I think, being able to get that, we get so many people that are just really they're shocked almost that we really work so hard to get it out the door and that they get it so fast, and it definitely gives them trust to purchase with us again, especially if they have a certain event in mind that they need their product in time for.
Yeah, brilliant. All right, and Matt, what do you think?
Similar sort of views. I actually think it's probably one of the most underrated and under-discussed part of or levers in the customer experience kind of matrix. I mean, it sounds sort of banal and obvious to say, but it's the customer's experience of your brand doesn't end when you take their money. And how much time are we actually spending on that part of the journey? And admittedly, we at CRG aren't doing the best job of that, but we want to make it a real focus. Because that moment, once you have taken their money and the stuff is actually arriving, that's when the promise and the magic that you sort of built all the way up into that stage, it either really comes to life and really gets tested in the real world. And if that experience falls over, even in small ways, like lack of clarity as to what's going on, the delays, your product arrives sort of crushed or broken or whatever it is, it can just so undermine your brand equity and your brand positioning. And it's a hard thing to get right, but it's also something that I think there's a lot of value in putting more focus on. Because ultimately, I think, there is very clear and established correlations between getting this right and driving higher repurchase rates and higher customer lifetime value. And I think that's where a lot of people perhaps miss the beat in this sort of piece. They're looking at it at a very transactional kind of level. How do I maximize the value that I can make out of every single transaction versus zooming out and taking a longer term view and going, okay, maybe I'm prepared to take a bit of a hit on the transaction here, but this is in service of driving higher customer lifetime value over the course of the year. So taking that kind of level. So that's something we're leaning into and wanting to work out how we can better master. Because ultimately, I think it's also the other thing I'd say is it's not just about speed. Ultimately, it's about control and convenience for the consumer. They just want the certainty and the ability to decide when they get it at a point in time that's good for them. So I think it's just a massive opportunity. So just really aiming that.
And fuss-free returns. Make them fuss-free.
Oh, it's such a controversial
topic
of conversation at board level.
Whole different question, right? Okay, very quick fire last question. Looking ahead, Re-commerce, social commerce, cross-border trade, AI. Gosh, there's so much changing. Which e-commerce trend are you both most excited about? Tara, what's yours?
Getting back to basics. So I think we're both aligned there, just getting back to basics and really doubling down on what businesses do really well.
Brilliant.
Look, for me, I think it's the intersectionality of it all. I think if you look at two things like the rise of Gen AI and product discovery on the part of Australian consumers, 6 in 10 are apparently using it every single week. What does that mean for how they're first starting their path to purchase? The intersection of that and the rise of social commerce. I think the upshot there is, traditional funnels and traditional marketing funnels are really collapsing and forming in a very different way. How do you respond to that? I think that's sort of both scary but an exciting challenge to face into because the landscape's just different.
100%. How do we leverage AI? How do we get everyone using it, right? And
do quite well. Anyway, AI towards the very end. That's
got to get it in there, right? Okay. Tara, Matt, thank you both. Your insights have been a masterclass in how to stay competitive, nimble and customer first in a fast-moving e-commerce world. Gary, back to you.
Thanks, Julie. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to sit down with someone who's been at the front line of digital retail transformation on a global scale, Jordan Burke. Jordan led Walmart's e-commerce acceleration in China and now heads up Tomorrow, a consultancy advising top-tier brands on staying ahead of the curve. In this conversation, he shares the latest strategies being used by international leaders and the trends shaping the future of e-commerce. Let's take a look.
So Jordan, thanks for joining us today. It's really great to have you here. And I know you've spent the last week or so in the country, so it's great to have a chat to you about what's happening here, but also around the world. But maybe let's step back and start just with a global view. We spoke about a year ago about marketplaces, both Amazon, but the cross-border players out of China. What's been happening over the last 12 months? What have you been seeing?
Well, your data shows that marketplaces are the fastest growing format here in Australia. I think if we even zoom out globally before we respond to that, marketplaces are now the #1 retail format globally. They do make up 69% of e-commerce sales globally, and it's still only 23% here in Australia. So while growing, there's probably still a lot of headroom for them here in Australia. And our perspective is Amazon and the other marketplaces have had a fairly active year. There has been a lot of investment, a lot of development, of course, some exit from the market, but mostly marketplaces leaning in, leading to that growth.
And so with that in mind, we'll stick maybe with the US. How are other players responding to that? What are some of the things you're seeing in terms of how others respond? We've seen Walmart sort of serial growth over the last few years, but there are other players there. What are some of the key things you're seeing?
We're seeing typically, Gary, the market bifurcates between retailers that want to take on Amazon and be alternative marketplaces and retailers that want to stay differentiated and specialty focused. Those like Walmart that are ready to lean in realize that they've got to be competitive as marketplaces. They've got to have the range, the price, the speed and convenience, the experience to be able to go up against an Amazon or others and even differentiate in that space. Whereas specialty retailers are figuring out how do they be the best in their category and truly separate themselves from the marketplace by being best in class in that category.
Right, okay, that's really interesting. Now, you mentioned speed was one of the things that you mentioned.
Yes.
Let's talk to us about that. So you've spoken to me in the last week about Amazon speeding up in the US, what we're seeing here in Australia. What does that mean and what are some of the things we need to think about here in Australia?
Yeah, it's probably been the largest change over the last 24 months in Amazon's business. They have committed to a same-day or faster proposition across the US, in much of Canada and much of England, and now most recently here. Same-day or faster has been the biggest growth driver for Amazon in its core business. What they find is they unlock new frequency-oriented occasions on the marketplace, things like essentials, even grocery. And that ends up driving more frequency, more prime stickiness, and it's really their biggest bet right now. And so what we're finding is marketplaces led by Amazon are leaning into that same day, and it's allowing them to compete for new categories and new occasions that they never could before. It's a huge change.
And so for some of the people online today listening to this webinar, what should they be thinking about? Clearly speeding up, but how fast is fast enough?
Great question. Well, first, I think I'd zoom out a minute and say I'd be thinking that you're in such a unique position in Australia because as we started with, marketplaces still only represent 23% of the market. They usually represent 69%. That headroom is opportunity. Now is the time to step in and, as a local retailer, decide, do you want to compete in that space, and how will you compete in that space? Because if unchecked, Amazon and other global marketplaces will probably match their penetration globally here in the next 5 years. But there's that window to be able to set up and say, what are we going to do to be able to outcompete that? And speed is a key part of it. Assume same day or faster in your 5 to 9 biggest cities are going to be standard. And in many categories, customers are going to see that at Amazon, and they're going to want that matched in your category.
Right, and I know it's something we're talking about at Australia Post. We can offer same day. What is the right sort of mix, and is a next day good enough? But it's something I think you're saying will continue to accelerate with Amazon and some of the other marketplace players.
I think I'd take the principle of you don't want to be convenience compromised. So if in your category next day or even 2 day is still standard among your competitive set, okay, that's probably where your customer is. But if you have competition that's going to that next day or faster proposition, you're going to have to keep up. And so just accept, embrace, and figure out how to innovate, partnerships included, to make sure you can deliver that.
Okay, so that's speed. What are some of the other things that we've been talking about are things like loyalty and social commerce. So maybe let's start with loyalty. What are you seeing from a loyalty perspective? What should Australian retailers be thinking about in terms of stickiness with their customers?
So creating a loyalty mechanism is absolutely one way to differentiate and to create a stronger connection with your customer. What we're seeing is traditional loyalty remains strong. The ability to reward customers that spend more with you, visit you more frequently, take actions that you believe are high value in the relationship, very, very powerful. However, the added layer to that is paid subscription. Giving customers the chance to prepay for free delivery or to prepay for unlocking benefits is now becoming a bigger and bigger mechanism as Prime and other programs have trained customers that subscription creates an even greater experience with that retailer. And so look at loyalty as a foundation. Look at paid subscription as that next layer to lock in your best customers.
Right. And so clearly loyalty is really important. At the same time, though, we've spoken about personalisation, so making that experience, a digital experience, as personal as it can be. I'm assuming I'd start with my most loyal customers. Is that where you'd start, or does that have to be right across the board?
Yeah, it's a great question. So actually, it ties to the previous question. So loyalty as a mechanism generally provides the dual benefit of creating closer stickiness to customers, but also giving you data on those customers that you can use to start to personalize and ultimately monetize in that relationship. Personalization has seen a dramatic leap forward in the last 5 years, and the best retailers globally are really starting to find that 30, 40, 50% of their sales are being influenced by experiences that are curated at a one-to-one level. And so taking the data that you're capturing on customers, increasingly via loyalty, make sure that you've got a personalization strategy to bring that experience so that when I log on and I'm going through my feed, it is mine. I mean, let's step back for a second. Aussies spend approximately 3 hours a day on completely personalized platforms. Instagram, YouTube, Netflix. They're accustomed to that feed being built as they swipe experience. So retailers need to understand that's the expectation increasingly. Use the data that you're accumulating through different channels to make sure you can show up in a me way more than just a mass way.
Okay. And you mentioned the swiping and, well, I guess social commerce.
Yeah.
Now, as we stand today, TikTok Shop hasn't launched yet, but it is, I anticipate it will, whether by the time this we're live or not. But what have you seen with that in the US, and what's different about that perhaps than some of the other social media platforms?
Yeah, it could. I mean, I'll be excited to see as of today if it's live. It's really had a dramatic effect on the U.S. market. What we found over Christmas was that TikTok Shop was the fastest growing channel for many beauty, health, food brands to some extent, not as much, but certainly in the beauty category where content and story and differentiation make such a difference, brands are finding that TikTok Shops really is an exciting alternative to Amazon and Walmart. And what's unique about TikTok Shops or social commerce in general is it's a more suitable channel for brands to sell direct, because brands will be the ones that produce that content, encourage that influencer engagement. They'll be the ones that connect directly in those platforms to consumers. And so we're finding most of the sales on TikTok Shops are brand sales, which is very unique. You know, the D2C vision, the dream has always been discussed. It's never been realized. We think TikTok Shops is that D2C future.
And do they, just out of interest, do retailers have to discount? Is that something where I can attract a premium if I'm capturing, in feed? And I asked the question because today, talking to a customer today, a player in wine who's launched a direct to consumer for their wine, which normally is sold through shops, physical shops, and they're getting amazing take up. It's growing faster than they thought, and they're keeping their prices high to not to support their physical retail. So somehow there's an attraction to that brand, and people going online to look at it, read the tasting notes, and then buy directly at a higher price point than they can in a physical store, which I found really interesting. So how does that translate maybe to then how am I surfacing that from a social commerce perspective and making the most of it?
So we see globally that there's an inverse relationship between the quality of your story and the need for a sale. The better the story, the less you rely on sales. So it really is a thing that the more you can compel and engage through content and story, the less that customer is looking for a discount in that moment. So absolutely, social commerce done well should be higher margin, less promotional commerce. That doesn't mean there won't be a big eventing. The festival experience will live in social media for sure, but on an everyday basis, those that cut through within social commerce will be because of that content, of that story.
Okay, that's interesting. And just, you mentioned the inverse proportionality. I assume Australia is no different in terms of, the number. We know that Australians shop 24% more households shop during Click Frenzy, Black Friday, Cyber Monday. So they're still attracted to those sale periods. Yes. I assume that's a global phenomenon and something we just have to lean into here. The retailers have to lean into here in Australia.
Absolutely global phenomenon. Key shopping festivals over the last 10 years have gone from a single day, typically a Black Friday, depending on what that means in that country, to even a monthly shopping festival cadence. So we think that Australia still has room to add a few dates on the calendar.
All right.
And we think those shopping festivals create excitement. They create a reason to pay attention for consumers. In an environment where content is so stimulating, so exciting, festivals give us a reason to go take a look. And so those shopping festival moments will continue to be peaks in the calendar, but they aren't the only moment when you need to show up great. And so making sure that you've got things tight on an everyday basis is as critical as being great at festivaling.
And how, for example, in the US, how often would there be an Amazon sale day in the future, do you think?
There were 10 last year. So Amazon did 10 shopping festivals last year. That was up from 5 3 years ago. The Chinese players are monthly, so they're called double days. So there's 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5,
that's
5,
where
6,
11
6, 7,
comes from.
That's 11. So when I was with Walmart in China, we essentially got down to a 12 shopping festival cadence. We even invented our own shopping festival called 8/8. So yeah, it's a very common way to get customers, get brands, get everybody to focus on a moment in that calendar where you can create excitement and cut through.
And just on that content piece, this is probably a tough question, but where to start? So I'm new to this. I'm a retailer here in Australia. You've talked about how I start to create and curate and sort of deliver that content out there. It seems like a black hole to me as an uninitiated content creator.
Yeah, so look, I think you have to understand that content is organic. So what can you do to control that process as a brand? We call it the 4 Ps. You have to have product, you have to have a panel, you have to have a pyramid of influencers, and then you've got to be ready to promote. Let me explain that quickly. Product. You've got to pick 1 or 2 products that you think you can create a great story around, something unique that makes that product stand out. We'll call that the hero product. Second, you've got to have a panel. You've got to have some folks you can turn to ideate. What could be a storyline? What's making that product something that people are going to want to watch for 90 seconds? Then you need a pyramid. The pyramid is where you start to develop a set of influencers, some that are high profile, some that are just everyday customers. And those are people that you're going to go out with your ideas and you're going to encourage them to go to social media and talk about that. Your promote is what you're going to pay them to do it. Typically, you'll pay between a 10 to 40% commission for any of the influencers in that panel to go out and tell that story and sell that story. You can start small. 1 product, 1 idea, one influencer, $1, get it to market and start learning over time. But having the 4 Ps in place creates a content factory that you can start to really rely on to drive sales.
Well, that's a great primer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we pivot now to a different topic, and that is re-commerce? So this idea of returns, end of line stock and so on. There's both C2C or peer-to-peer, me selling you a second-hand suit, and then B2C where a retailer has end of line stock. How do I dispose of it? So what are you seeing in terms of re-commerce around the world and in the US?
It's exciting because it's still fairly small. It's a $100 billion business. I'm seeing data that it might end up at about 150 to 200 billion within the coming couple of years in the US, which is much smaller than social commerce and others. However, it's growing rapidly, and we think it's yet to see the tipping point because retailers are not participating yet in a meaningful way. As you mentioned, peer-to-peer platforms like Facebook Marketplace, like Vinted, like Craigslist in the US, they are seeing that 100 to 150 billion occur within those platforms. That's very organic. Retailers are now starting to discover that they can participate. They can take a return, they can take a closeout, and instead they can refurbish it, repackage it, and make that a resale item where they can profit from it. They can help the planet, they can help the consumer find value. We think re-commerce is a really exciting growth area, but it's going to come down to logistics. Probably more than any of the themes we've talked about so far, it's going to be how can I get that item from one store to a consumer's home efficiently, and that's not easy.
No, that's not. And we're seeing some retailers start to pilot ideas, and we're piloting picking up from the doorstep, for example, from the postie picking up. But that's early days, but something we think we need to keep working on. Let's turn now to the last topic I wanted to cover, which is AI.
Yeah.
Now we can run 100 miles an hour from it, or we can lean into it, and I think we're seeing it in contact centres, in merchandising, product management, in certain areas, but directly with consumers. What are you seeing, and what are the thoughts around how to start to test and learn in that whole, maybe it's agent to consumer type space?
So much talk in the last 3 years, and we actually think 2025 is a tipping point moment with consumers. We're finding millions and millions of consumers having their oh my God AI moment every month. And you know what that moment is, Gary. It's when you're using a GPT or a Claude and you realize that this technology can actually do things that no technology's ever done for you before. And it's really a special moment you realize that. Once you do, what we're finding is consumers begin to search for things or want to learn about things first in an agent, like a GPT, before they go to an e-commerce platform. In the US over Christmas, traffic from agents to e-commerce sites was up 1,300%.
Wow.
That's a massive step in traffic. And so we're saying that retailers have to prepare for an A to C era. We've been in the B to C era for 100 years. We're moving into an A to C era where agents will be tools that consumers use to engage with retailers. They'll be tools that retailers use to deploy, to work with customers, and ultimately there could be A to A relationships that are facilitated. So we're seeing a lot of exciting activity where retailers are trying to figure out, how do I show up in a GPT response? How do I link effectively from an agent discussion into my platform? How, when they arrive on my platform, do I have an agent that can help them navigate that site and that experience? It's an exciting area. We think within 5 years, 10% of e-commerce will be A to C.
And it's interesting, my aha moment, my daughter is in a gap year, wants to spend 5 months in Southeast Asia, so asked me for some advice. I would have typically gone to a Lonely Planet physical book. I went to ChatGPT, said 5 months, a couple of things that she's interested in, gallery, and it mapped out a 5-month agenda.
Yeah.
The next step, I guess, would be, can I start to book, how do I start to interact from a commerce perspective? But that was, it mapped it out by country, 5 countries over these 5 months, these dates, these sites, these planes, buses, trains in between them. Quite amazing.
It is. And she could take that agent with her, and that agent could learn her over that 5-month period to be the point where she never has to ask anything. It's there in her hand.
It's quite amazing.
Yep.
There's some really great food for thought. Yep. So maybe in closing, we've covered a lot today.
Yep.
I guess, what are a couple of key messages for the audience around, marketplaces are on the advance.
Yep.
We're early enough in the journey where there's still a time for us to intervene, to really push hard into how we engage our customers, how we have a value proposition that stacks up. What are a couple of key messages for the audience to take away? Or maybe just synthesising everything you've covered, a couple of the themes you've covered today.
Look, Look, I think as an outside-in perspective, this is an incredible window. 2025 will be the window where Australian retailers have the chance to rewrite how this market evolves going forward, because marketplaces, and particularly global marketplaces, see this as the moment to capture the market and match the share that they've been able to achieve in other countries. But if local retailers are willing to lean in and be aggressive, this is their market to lose. Looking at how to be fast, efficient on delivery is going to be critical. And I assume you'll be having lots of conversations about that. I would if I were a retailer. What am I going to be doing to keep up with the same day or faster revolution that is underway and is going to take this market, we believe? Meanwhile, I'd be looking at social commerce and ensuring, particularly if I'm a brand, that I'm showing up in that environment, leveraging those 4 Ps we just talked about of how to stand up a content factory. And then finally, I'd be making sure I keep my finger on the pulse of e-commerce, of other emerging growth areas in the channel that are going to be really exciting, and you've got to make sure you understand. Don't miss them.
Well, that's some fantastic food for thought. So look, thank you for joining us. It'd be wonderful having you here, and look forward to continuing a discussion with you and your thoughts from afar over the next couple of years.
Thanks, Gary. Keep moving.
So a really interesting session with Jordan, and a lot to sort of take away from that. And I hope you got a lot out of that too. So we'll now go to our panel, and we have all of us back here now to have a chat about e-commerce and some of the questions that you've put through already. And there's quite a few questions here on the board, so we'll perhaps go straight to the questions. I may start with the first question here at the top on Gen X. So the love the stats on Gen X and older for social and digital use for shopping. What are some of the things that we're seeing, Mark, when it comes to Gen X? And we talked a little bit about baby boomers earlier.
Yeah, well, definitely the older generations are responding to these times and the trends. And what's keeping them actually across this is that they've got the young adult children living at home. And that's keeping them in touch with that next generation more than we saw in the past when people had hit 18 or 19, they'd leave home. The majority of 25-year-olds, in fact, the median age of leaving home is now 26. So the majority of 20-somethings are still living with their parents, keeping their parents, the Gen Xer or the baby boomer, in touch with these trends, and even bringing the technology into the home or giving them a bit of a heads up with it. So that intergenerational connection is ensuring that even the older generations are engaged in e-commerce, social media, and connections on these digital platforms.
So I have a personal experience with that, and you've given me a tip for when my son will move out. So my wife is now madly on TikTok thanks to her daughter, my 19-year-old, and my son will move out in 2 years. So
There you go.
26. Okay. So the next question, do you think other Australian retail giants will try to build their own marketplace to compete with Temu and Amazon? I may throw to the panel for this as well, but I guess I think from what I've seen, I think retailers are trying to perhaps not take Amazon head on. I don't know that that's the right strategy. And we heard Jordan spoke about Walmart. They certainly did in the US and very successfully, and they really have been very strategic about how they've done that. In fact, and you may have seen some news earlier this week that they're actually now collaborating. So as much as Amazon and Walmart compete, they're collaborating. But Walmart's really one of the only ones globally I've seen. I think in Australia, many players are trying to speed up deliveries, think about their fulfillment and how they can compete effectively. But I don't know that they'd directly try to take on and have the sort of the vast array of products and have an offer similar. But I don't know, I may start with Julie and Matt here in the studio and just ask you what you think.
Yeah, I think most of them actually already have their own marketplaces, but I just don't think they can compete.
At the scale.
Not at the scale, not at the scale, not at the service, not at the quantity of products that are on there. And this is Amazon with decades of experience in doing this. And it's difficult for anyone to compete. So they'll definitely have a marketplace to have an endless aisle for sure, and do a lot of drop shipping, but I don't think there's competition anytime soon.
Matt?
Yeah, similar perspective. I think for me, it's really a question of strategic focus. Sometimes running down this path sort of undercuts your ability to do what I spoke about before, like emulating these players in terms of their razor sharp and relentless obsession with how they think they're going to win, and just really focusing on that. So to try and mimic how others are winning in the marketplace, I'm not sure that's necessarily the right call for a lot of big retailers. But also to Julie's point, marketplace is a hard game. Like, it's thin margins and requires huge scale. It's complicated. It's, is that distracting you from the core of your business where you can probably have the biggest impact?
And one of the things, and I'll throw to Tara, but one of the things that resonated with me when I spoke to Jordan a few weeks back was the TikTok shop in the US, brands direct to market, and how they're able to cut through on a marketplace, you're paying to get up, to be seen. And so it's an interesting channel, and we'll see. They haven't launched yet here in Australia, but there are other social channels, but certainly TikTok seems to be a very popular one. So Tara, I don't know if you have any other perspective on that question.
I think, there's very few players in the game that would be able to directly compete in Australia with the likes of Amazon. So it is more about looking at how can you work with them to better your business. I also think by, increasing your marketplace capability as a brand, you're diluting what is your golden product and what you really want your customers and your community to focus on. And I think also coming with TikTok Shop, I know there's such a high return rate, especially for brands. So rather than focusing on that initial revenue, we really need to dial down and focus on the profitability and just make sure that we're not forgetting about that return factor as well in that piece.
I think that's a really good point, Tara, and I do wonder, and I've spoken to smaller players who have ended up on a marketplace, and typically Amazon, but others, and are learning that as they go. So they may get eyeballs and they may get some sales early on, but understanding the entire value chain and the long game, absolutely. Now, there's a question: is this being recorded? Yes, it is. It will be available on YouTube, and we'll have it available from early next week. So please do look at that, and we'll send out a link with that. Really interesting question. This is really one for the three of you, for Julie, Tara and Matt. How would you not devalue the brand from participating in so many discounting events? So this is that old chestnut about the number of sale days now. Click Frenzy, May Mayhem, even people who mimic Amazon Prime, Singles Day, Black Friday. So it feels like every other week there's a sale. We're in end of financial year now, sale. What are your views online? Maybe I'll go back and start with Tara first online.
I think you just really need to show value in your products. Your consumer needs to be, really comfortable with the price that they're paying, and the product offering matches the price. I'm a big one for let's all just, as a community, let's try to just step away from those days that are just, plugged in by these players to make us discount. But at the end of the day, the revenue might be there, but the profitability is not. And that's why I think we're seeing a lot of small businesses go under, because they're focusing on these big revenue numbers when they just don't have the margins to support. But again, growing your community and just making them feel really comfortable with the brands that they're supporting at full price is super important.
Any other perspectives here in the room?
I think they have a place. So these discount, they do have a place, and we see massive peaks when we do them. But there's a way that you can do them. So, Afterpay Day, as an example, used to be one day. It's now like a week. So, but don't do it for a week. So something that's been massively effective for us is doing things for 40 minutes. And in fact, we did a sale recently for 10. So, we did it for 10, and we created an enormous amount of hype for that 10. So when we do it, people get overly excited about it. But the rest of the time, you're full price. And you can do other things like have gift with purchase. You can do things for certain subsets. If you've got a loyalty program, if you've got a Facebook group, there's different things that you can do. But basically, get your community excited. One of our values is to wow. And we wow our customers and we wow our team. So wow them, but do it in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates. I think there's always going to be tentpole moments in the market that you just need to participate in for lots of good reasons. Cyber will always be a big one, I think.
Yeah.
But for us, I think the way that we're thinking about it is how do we move more of our pricing strategy to a below-the-line approach and do it on a segment-driven basis. So we're protecting those less price-sensitive customers that are high value from those promos because they're going to spend anyway, so why subsidise? But really making different other cohorts within our base sweat in a different way based on their sensitivity, but offering them different discounts. I think that's the challenge. So many of the promos are done above the line on a global basis, and inevitably just giving out discounts indiscriminately as to whether that customer cares or doesn't care. So, yeah.
Now, I notice we've already run out of... There are so many questions coming through. What I will say is, and there's one for you, Tara, about Proud Poppy Community. I think what we'll do is, because we can't get to them now and we need to finish right on 10:30, we'll come back to those we emailed and who signed up. We'll send some questions back and perhaps ask the panel if they could help us out with some questions that are specifically aimed at them. So look, thank you to the panel firstly, and thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information on any of the insights we've touched on today, you can find our latest e-commerce report in the bottom right-hand tile of your webinar console. Or if you'd like to revisit any of today's sessions, as I said, they'll soon be available on demand as podcast episodes. We'll email these directly to you once they're live. And finally, a short survey will be sent out to your inbox, and we really do appreciate you taking the time to give us feedback so we can continue to improve these events. Thank you again, stay safe and see you next time.